Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Giorgio Marfella, and I'm the chair of the Architects Registration Board of Victoria. Welcome to another webinar of the ARBV. As always, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands in which we are today. In particular, I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present. So today we have a topic of growing relevance, modern methods of construction, and in particular, we would like to discuss some regulatory implications of this. Well, I would like to be tempted to say new technologies, but somehow they are more of a format of delivery of projects that involves sometimes new technology, but also existing ones like prefabrication that have been around for a long time. And as always, this is a webinar that is valid for formal continuing professional development in Victoria. And in order to participate, you can obtain a certificate of attendance. We'll be providing a QR code through the presentation today. And you should be able to scan it right now. And a link also will be available to you. And we will also submit back to you a form as proof of attendance, and you will have 24 hours to fill in the questionnaires after today. So I will also remind everybody this is a mandatory, CPD is a mandatory requirement in Victoria, and the ARBV monitors CPD compliance. Our presenter today is Francis. Francis is a special counsel, Francis Hall, special counsel from Weir Legal. Francis has been with us before. And so of course, as always, if there's any questions, we'll leave some time towards the end. Feel free to put anything of relevance in the Q&A section. If time allows, we'll have a bit of a discussion to close the presentation. With this, I can simply hand over to you, Fran.
Thanks very much, Giorgio, and thank you for having me to present today. As Giorgio mentioned, modern methods of construction is a topic that is of great interest at the moment. It's being talked about a lot by government, but it's not really a new thing. So the question is, why are we talking about it? And how does it fit in to our regulatory system, and what are the things to look out for you as architects? So you'll see we've got an outline that we're going of the topics that we're going to cover today. Why are we talking about MMC? How is it regulated in Victoria? What are the gaps and what risks do they pose for architects? What's an architect's role when utilising MMC in a design or in administering a contract? What are the risks for architects and how to mitigate them? And what's the upcoming reform in Victoria? Because there is a lot of reform that is on the horizon at the moment. So to start with, what is MMC? Modern methods of construction is a sort of a terminology that's come about in the last year or two. It's really a catch-all term. It's not a defined term. You won't find the phrase modern methods of construction in the Building Act or in the National Construction Code. It is now referenced in the Domestic Building Contracts Act after some recent amendments, and I will talk to that a bit later on in this webinar. But even in the DBCA, it's still not defined. So it is really a sort of a broad term, and it's used to mean offsite or automated construction. It includes prefabricated buildings. It includes modular, or sometimes it's called volumetric construction of apartments or units that might be built completely off-site and then craned into place and fixed into the structure of an apartment building or some other type of building. It also includes off-site construction of component parts or systems. So that might be anything from wall systems to bathroom pods to smaller kind of building elements. And it also can include things like 3D printing or other robotic type of construction. So it's really used to capture a range of work that departs from that accepted, understood meaning of construction work carried out by human beings on a building site. So there has been a lot of talk in the last few years about the advantages of MMC, and I've described them as potential advantages because I think that there is still not a lot of really clear data about this, but there is sort of an increasing acceptance by government that using MMC can reduce the length of a build, that it may reduce the cost of a build, that products or buildings that are built offsite in a factory utilizing machinery and robotic methods can improve precision and quality control in the built product, and that there is also potentially a lower carbon footprint. And there is certainly a bit of data about reduced length of build in the context of variability of weather. Certainly being able to build offsite takes out that factor of delay that can really add into build time in traditional construction work. So why are we talking about MMC now? I'm sure many of you would be very aware that off-site construction is not a new concept, and Giorgio referred to that in his comments at the start of this webinar. It's really not a new thing. Precast concrete panels have been used for a really long time, so have prefabricated buildings. It's standard to utilise roof trusses that have been designed and manufactured off-site. Light gauge steel framing is also becoming very commonplace now. So the idea that parts, greater or lesser, of building work are being built off-site and then installed on-site later is not a new concept at all. Really what has prompted a really big change over the last couple of years, apart from an increase in technological capability, is really the Productivity Commission findings in February of this year, which I think have really kind of supercharged the, I suppose, the authorising environment for MMC. Governments are very willing to contemplate this being brought into our building and construction system and to consider regulatory change. So what the Productivity Commission found was that we have a housing crisis in that we need another 1.2 million homes over the next 5 years. But we need that in a context where housing construction productivity is going down. There are longer build times. Quality of construction is increasing, but the uptake of innovation is slow. Manufacturers are much faster to innovate than builders are. And as a result, in Australia, currently only 5% of construction occurs via MMC. And just as a note, this varies a lot across different jurisdictions in the world. So in Japan, for example, the use of MMC is relatively greater at around 15%. In Sweden, it's incredibly high. The vast majority of building work is carried out off-site. So that sort of goes to show that it is possible to incorporate MMC into standard construction work, but the environment has to be there for that to happen. So why has it not happened in Australia yet is the question. And one of the reasons for that, this is continuing from the Productivity Commission. These are findings of the Productivity Commission. One of the findings was that there's high fragmentation in the construction sector, meaning that most construction businesses are small businesses or they are individual contractors. So that's not a sort of work environment that is conducive to taking on innovative technology. One of the biggest reasons that I think MMC uptake hasn't been greater in Victoria and in Australia more generally to date is the fact that regulation just absolutely has not kept pace with the technology. So as I mentioned earlier, there is no reference to MMC in the Building Act. There's no reference to it in the National Construction Code. And one of the things that I'll talk about in a little while is the our sort of regulatory processes are not geared to work that is carried out off-site. Right at the moment, our regulatory processes sort of contemplate a traditional construction project where there is a design and then the building work is carried out by human beings on a building site. So there is a really large gap at the moment between the regulatory space and the technology that's available. And then I think another reason why the uptake hasn't been greater is that the perception among consumers regarding MMC has probably not been a positive one. If you're like me, then you might associate in the past MMC with things like prefabricated granny flats or portable classrooms or the sort of prefabricated building elements that are used in facilities rather than in homes. And so I think what that has meant is that there is perhaps not an understanding of how MMC can be utilised in a more commercial or a domestic setting in a way that is high quality and aesthetically pleasing. And I would add, I think one of the factors that I think is also relevant is that in Australia, I think for businesses that are creating an MMC product, it is hard to achieve scale because Australia is a small market generally, and it's also a market where every state regulates building work differently, and that makes it quite hard, I think, to sell your product and achieve scale in a way that is not sort of really cost prohibitive. So what's happening now? So we know that changes are underway, prompted by the housing crisis at both a national and a state level. Governments are seeking ways to increase the speed of production. We also know that the MMC sector is working together. There are various peak bodies that have been established. They are advocating for their products and technologies. They're pushing for reform, and they are starting to achieve scale in their production capacity. And I think there's also been perhaps a change in consumer sentiment. So that takes us to our first quiz question. And you'll see that QR code is on your screen. So if you haven't already scanned it, just take a moment and scan it with your phone. That will enable you to answer the question. The first question is, what has prompted the need for reform relating to MMC? Is it A, the need to increase housing stocks quickly? B, confusion about what it means? C, the lack of reference to it in the NCC or the Building Act? Or D, all of the above? I'll just give you 30 seconds or so to answer that first question before we move on to our next topic. Okay. Now, in terms of the regulatory issues, there's a number to go through, and I've broken them down by the various stages to which they relate. But I thought that I would begin this part of the presentation by just giving you a quick refresher of regulation of building work in Victoria, so that you can see where the kind of pinch points really emerge for MMC. So in Victoria, as you know, building work is regulated by the Building Act, and under Section 16 of the Building Act, building work must comply with the Act, with the building regulations, and with the National Construction Code, which is incorporated by reference into the regulations. The National Construction Code itself, as you would be aware, sets out performance requirements that the building work must meet, and it incorporates by reference a number of Australian standards. So depending on whether you're following the deemed to satisfy provisions in the NCC or whether you're utilising a performance solution, it may be the case that Australian standards will apply to that work. At the commencement stage of the building work, a building permit will be issued by the relevant building surveyor, or RBS, and that building permit will be based on the application for the building permit and all of the documents that accompany that. So that will be the detailed design drawings, it will be the engineering drawings and computations, it will be any certificates of compliance issued by engineers, and it may include other documents as well, for example, fire engineering reports, soil reports. The list of documents will vary depending on what the nature of the product is, nature of the building work is, sorry. And then during the building work, mandatory inspections are carried out, and that is to ensure that the building work is being carried out in compliance with the requirements of the Act and the NCC, and also with the permit. So the inspections will also confirm whether or not what is being constructed matches the design that was approved. So when you think about the regulatory structure of building work, you can see then that a number of issues arise for MMC in that current landscape. So at building permit stage, there could be issues to do with approval of product use, of certifications, of performance solutions, and there could also be issues during or there could be issues in terms of what the RBS specifies in the permit to be the inspection stages for the building work. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a minute. During the building work, there is then the question of how and where to carry out inspections, what documents to rely on. And then there are other issues as well that emerge. Progress payments for the work in a context where perhaps a large component of the work is being carried out off-site. What happens where there is insolvency on the part of the MMC manufacturer, and issues to do with registration or licensing of the workers who are carrying out that work. So, as I mentioned a minute ago, there are issues that the RBS needs to deal with when assessing a design for the purpose of an application for a building permit. Under Section 24(1) of the Building Act, the RBS cannot issue a permit unless they can be satisfied that the work will comply with the Act and the building regulations. So, as I mentioned, this means that the application for building permit has to include documents which demonstrate how the building work will comply. And that will include a variety of different documents. So we're going to jump to our second quiz question now. Question 2 is, when can compliance of an MMC product, system or method be approved? Is it A, it must be approved at building permit stage? B, it can be included at any stage so long as there is appropriate documentation for it? Or C, it can be approved at occupancy permit stage so long as there is appropriate documentation for it? I'll just give you a few seconds to answer that. Okay, so the answer for question 2 is A, it must be approved at building permit stage. I will say that you can, of course, amend a building permit. So things can change and MMC could be incorporated at a later stage, but that would only be lawful and correct if the building permit were to be amended, and that amendment occurred prior to the use of the product. So those of you who have heard previous webinars from me might remember that this is something I've mentioned a few times, that building permits can be amended, but they can't be amended retrospectively. So if you're going to change something, you need to change it before you've actually carried out that work. Okay, moving on to the NCC compliance methods. Just a reminder about how that works. So a building design has to comply with the performance requirements in the NCC. That will be either via a deemed to satisfy design or a performance solution. Now, that doesn't mean that every building product that is used in building work has to demonstrate compliance. The product only needs to be compliant where that's relevant to satisfying the particular performance requirement that is in question. Now, for things like modular apartments or bathroom pods or things like that, there absolutely will be a need to demonstrate compliance, because that constitutes such a large proportion of the building work that there will be a number of performance requirements that need to be demonstrated have been complied with. So there are a number of evidence of suitability pathways under the NCC. I won't run through them, but you can see them in that list on the screen. So what that means is that for a MMC type of product or building element, there are a number of different ways that you can demonstrate that they are a suitable product that is compliant with the NCC. Now, the tricky part, I guess, is where you need to achieve demonstration of compliance for something that is quite detailed and contains a lot of elements or components. So something like a wall system, you might be able to get code mark certificate for that. That means demonstration of compliance once that code mark has been achieved by the manufacturer, then it's a relatively straightforward process to incorporate that into a design and for that design to be assessed by the RBS as being suitable. It becomes harder the more complete the item is that you're talking about. So for example, for a sort of a complete modular apartment that is constructed off-site in a factory, that's not a product, a building product in that kind of traditional way that we might understand what a building product is. And so it's not really possible to get code mark certification for something like that. And so what that would need is a detailed set of design drawings and engineering drawings, and also probably a certification of compliance design from an engineer or the like to support proof of compliance of design. There is also some kind of movement in terms of bathroom and plumbing products. So the Australian Building Codes Board has issued a direction that says that bathroom pods, which are a sort of a full and complete prefabricated bathroom that can be installed into a building, they can achieve watermark certification. So that simplifies the process of demonstrating compliance for the purpose of issuing a building permit. But as you can appreciate, some types of MMC are much more conducive to demonstrating compliance than others. So really, the same issues arise for MMC as arise with any kind of architectural design. So the design has to be sufficiently detailed to clearly show how compliance will be achieved. Where certificates are being relied on to demonstrate compliance, then those certificates need to be current and they need to apply to the proposed use. So you would need to check that those certificates apply to the specific use that you're considering, if you're considering incorporating this into a building design. Where a product is imported from overseas, compliance obviously still needs to be achieved, and so the documents that are available need to be carefully assessed to ensure that compliance can be demonstrated. And there may be, depending on what it is that's being imported, there may need to be in Australia a detailed design review carried out, assessment of materials, and an inspection regime. So that takes us to question 3. How can a system, product, or building made off-site be verified for compliance for the purpose of inclusion in a building design? Is it A, a performance solution is required for it? B, documentation must be provided that verifies compliance via one of the pathways in the NCC? C, the RBS can approve it as part of the building permit documentation? Or D, these systems or products can't be verified for compliance? Just give you a moment to put in your answer for that. Okay, so the answer for this question is B. In terms of answer A, it's not always the case that a performance solution is needed. It might be possible for a deemed to satisfy solution to be applicable. It is also true with answer C, the RBS can approve it, but they can only do that if they've got the documentation that's referred to in B. Okay, so the next regulatory issue that we have is mandatory inspections. So in terms of inspection stages, you would all be familiar with the concept that the building permit that is issued by the RBS has to set out the mandatory inspection stages for the building work. The building regulations prescribe some mandatory stages, although this may depend on the type of building work. So, for example, prior to footings, foundation, frame, final, it's pretty standard. For some classes of building now, there will be additional waterproofing inspections. The RBS has the discretion to add more stages. This is not something that's particularly well understood, but the RBS has a lot of discretion when they issue a building permit, and they can add as many inspection stages as they like. They tend not to. Most RBSs will stick with the minimum prescribed stages, but their power to do that is always there. So the issue that we have is that work might be completed offsite that doesn't match the stages that are in the building permit, and how do we deal with that? So there is no easy answer to this question at the moment. As the Building Act is sort of framed, it really doesn't contemplate this kind of issue. So what it means is that if some or a lot of the work is being completed offsite in a factory, then it might mean that inspections need to be carried out offsite as well. There may need to be additional inspections, so the inspection stages might need to be specified so that an inspector goes out and carries out an inspection prior to concealment of the relevant things. So prior to for example, prior to the installation of walls or other things that cover up matters which need to be inspected. So what's really required at this stage is for the RBS to turn their mind to how and when inspections are to be carried out, so that they can make sure that the inspections are carried out at the mandated inspection stages, whether that's offsite or on-site. And there may also need to be additional inspections on-site to ensure that something which has been constructed off-site but is then being installed or assembled on-site, that occurs correctly. Now, the next sort of gap that exists between our existing regulatory regime and MMC relates to progress payments. You'll all be familiar with the idea that for domestic building work, progress payments are controlled by the provisions of the Domestic Building Contracts Act. Stage payments are not to exceed the specified percentages of the total contract price. This is different for work that doesn't fall within the Domestic Building Contracts Act. The gap arises in that for MMC construction, large volumes of the work might be completed offsite at a relatively early stage, and that might mean that large payments are required which don't match in any way the stages that are prescribed under the DBCA. Now, there has been amendments passed to the Domestic Building Contracts Act. Those changes went through Parliament and were passed in September of this year. They haven't yet taken effect. They will take effect next year. We don't yet know the date on which the relevant provisions will start to take effect, but there have been some quite significant amendments to that Act generally, but also specifically in relation to this particular issue, and I will talk a little bit about that a bit later on. And the next issue where there is sort of a gap between our current regulatory regime and MMC is in the area of insurance. So where the work is carried out off-site and where it's not carried out by a registered builder, bearing in mind that some MMC work is carried out by registered builders. So this is just talking about a scenario where that's not the case. Then there is no, where it's not carried out by a registered builder, then it won't be work for which domestic building insurance is issued. So the impact for that is that where the manufacturer becomes insolvent, there won't be any recourse to insurance. Now, what sort of risk that poses for the project really depends on how much of the project is linked to an MMC construction method. And of course, it's always a risk. Insolvency is always a risk in any building project. The rate of insolvencies for builders has increased significantly over the last few years. So insolvency is always a risk, but the risk is different for builders in the sense that there has been, for domestic building work at least, the last resort domestic building insurance that was required for that sort of building work, and with recent amendments to the Building Act, that's now moving to a first resort insurance product. So there is capacity for insurance for that type of building work that is not available for work that is carried out not by registered builders. So that takes me to the next sort of regulatory gap, which is in relation to registration of workers. So where products are made off-site in a factory, that may not constitute building work, depending on the context, and that will mean that it won't be carried out by a registered builder or by registered building practitioners, because no registration is required. So that means that although the on-site work, so the installation, fixing down, that will still be carried out in a regular manner for the offsite component of the work, where it's carried out with unregistered workers, there is, I suppose, an additional gap in the sense that the people carrying out the work are not sort of regulated by the Building and Plumbing Commission. They can't be held responsible for their conduct via a disciplinary process or anything like that. The enforcement processes that are available, so building notices and orders, they won't be able to be issued in this sort of a context. So that's just an additional gap that currently exists. So question 4, how can work carried out off-site be verified for compliance? A, via mandatory inspections. B, by reliance on the manufacturer's quality assurance process. C, reliance on design documentation. Or D, assessing compliance once installed on site. I'll give you a few seconds to answer that. Okay, so the answer to question 4 is A, via mandatory inspections. Reliance on design documentation won't get you there. That is only relevant to verifying whether the design itself is compliant, not whether the work is compliant. So you always need an inspection. In terms of reliance on the manufacturer's QA process, that's not available under the current regulatory regime, but I will talk in a minute about proposed reform, and that is one of the possibilities that comes up. Okay, issues and risks for architects. I've identified a few here at both design stage and contract administration stage. So at design stage, there are various things that architects can do to minimise the risk of non-compliance emerging. One of them is to ensure that the design is as detailed and complete as possible. So where MMC is proposed to be utilised, that would mean making sure at an early stage that you have all of the relevant documentation, including drawings, including any compliance certificates, code mark, that sort of thing, that you have those at an early stage. Where the scope of your work is limited, and I understand that that is a consistent issue that exists at the moment, that architects may be presented with a limited scope of work, or where the design and construct model is used, meaning that there might be changes or that your work cannot be complete as you would like it to be because your scope has been limited contractually, then you should make clear that any additions or alterations must be compliant and must be signed off by the RBS. It's also useful to design to ensure that design coordination occurs at an early stage between architects and engineers, and that includes in reference to MMC products or methods of construction. And lastly, and most importantly, is liaising with the RBS. If at the building permit stage you have any concerns or compliance matters that you think should be flagged with the RBS, you should turn your mind to that and you should raise them and document that you have raised them. So at the contract administration stage, there are other steps that you can take as architects to mitigate your risk. One is to act early where there are issues between the payments in the contract, DBCA progress payments, and sort of MMC requirements. Then you may need to, or it may be appropriate to turn your mind to whether or not the contract adequately reflects what has to happen, and to raise that at an early stage if you think that might not be the case. You should also make sure that offsite work is being suitably supervised, so that inspections or compliance documentation is provided to you at an early stage. You should ensure that all required documentation is supplied regarding compliance, so any certificates that need to be provided to you or additional drawings. And you should, as with that design stage, liaise early with the RBS where you identify any issues or concerns during the course of the building work. That takes us to question 5 in our quiz for today. What step can architects take to address the gaps in the regulatory framework for MMC? Is it A, avoid using it in projects? B, exclude liability in contracts where MMC is incorporated into the design? C, put the manufacturer's product information into the design documentation? Or D, ensure design documentation is full and complete and addresses compliance of products or methods via NCC suitability pathways? You have a few seconds to answer that question. And the answer to that question is D. Okay, reforms on the horizon. There's quite a few changes that are being flagged in relation to MMC. So as I mentioned, there were changes to the Domestic Building Contracts Act that were passed in September of this year. And as I've mentioned, the DBCA regulates the amount that is claimable as progress payments. So what's happened is that those sections that specify that have been amended so that contracts which are contracts utilising MMC will be able to differentiate in terms of the percentage of the total contract price that can be claimed. And that depends on what proportion of the building work is MMC. So there'll be different prescribed amounts for where the MMC is over 50%, where it's between 30 to 50%, or where it's less than 30%. Now, we don't know what those percentages are just yet. That's going to go into the domestic building contract regulations, and those have not been passed yet. But I would anticipate that that would happen at some stage next year. So that's something to keep your eye out for and update yourselves about, because that will be a big change to progress payments. Now, another sort of area for reform is that the Department of Transport and Planning has recently gone through a consultation process and put out a discussion paper highlighting areas for reform. And one of the things that they have identified is, as I've mentioned, that there are, in the Building Act, there's currently really no definitions of any of these sort of MMC kind of technologies. So one of the things that they are considering is including in the Building Act new definitions that would relate to prefabricated or offsite work. They have also raised the possibility of a design practitioner declaration regarding prefabricated work, which I think is pretty interesting. Many of you would be familiar with the idea that in New South Wales, all design has to be the subject of a design practitioner declaration, that it's compliant, and that applies to architects and other types of building designers. That doesn't exist in Victoria. There's no obligation on architects to do that. But there is this possibility that for prefabricated items that there will be this design compliance statement. There also may be a new class of building inspectors, being a class that relates specifically to inspection of prefabricated buildings and things that are built offsite. There is also a possibility for amending the Building Act to create new inspection stages for offsite work to address that gap that I spoke about earlier, in terms of the mandatory inspection stages and how that really just doesn't reflect what happens when buildings are built offsite. And then there is a possibility for product certification or manufacturer certification. So what that would mean is that where you have a sort of a prefabricated product, instead of there being an inspection regime, so that this would be put as an alternative reform to the creation of new mandatory inspection stages. An alternative would be to have a product that is certified. So that would mean that the design of that product has been approved as being a compliant design, that the manufacturer's process for manufacturing of it has been sort of inspected and certified. And rather than having inspections of each product that is built, there is instead a sort of a certification of the product, and that would be supported by an ongoing quality assurance process, auditing, sort of regular auditing, that sort of thing. So that sort of treats the regulation of MMC as a product rather than as work. So that's quite a different approach to changing the inspection stages. So there has been a public consultation process about that. And there is likely to be legislative reform within the next year or two. There has also been some commercial changes. So one of the problems with MMC in the past has been that it's difficult to use it because commercial products such as construction loans may not be prepared to recognise work that is being carried out this way and payments that are made in a way that differs from the usual progress payments. And so it has been hard to get finance on a project that uses this sort of technology. I understand that there is change on that front, that CBA has now issued a financing product that recognises it. And that may then also prompt insurers to be perhaps more welcoming of this type of technology in a project. And lastly, there is also the potential for national reform. So this would, in the context of Victoria, what this would likely mean is changes to the National Construction Code. And so that might include, for example, putting consistent definitions into the NCC about what MMC is and when it can be used. There is also a proposal for a national voluntary certification scheme. So again, that would be sort of a product certification scheme along the lines of what I spoke about just earlier, but it would operate in a national way, which would mean that products can be used in different states and territories without the need for an entirely separate sort of compliance process to be gone through. So that takes us to our last question, question 6. What are the problems with MMC that Victorian legislative reform will seek to address? Is it A, the speed of building approvals, B, the consumer perception of the products, C, certification of products and inspections regime, or D, difficulties in obtaining finance? So the answer to that one is C, certification of products and inspections regime. This takes me to my last slide, which is if you are seeking some guidance on MMC and evidence of suitability, the Australian Building Codes Board has some really useful handbooks. They are available on the ABCB website. There's a link there, but you can just Google it and it'll come up, and those are particularly practical and helpful. So I will stop sharing my screen and we may have a couple of minutes left available where we can take any questions.
Thank you, Fran. Yes, there's quite a few questions. They're all very interesting. So apologies, I might have to pick a few ones for reasons of time. So by all means, that's not because the other ones, I would love to really go through all of them. But I'd like to start with one, Fran, you might be able to give us a fairly straightforward answer as a lawyer. It's this one. In case of insolvency of a prefabrication house supplier, does the client own the partially constructed building located off-site and can take possession, presuming they have paid progress payments as required? When paid for and built on client's land, ownership is more clear.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it will really depend on the terms of the contract. So some manufacturers might try and put a retention of title clause into their contract. So it might mean that they try to retain ownership of it until it's completed or paid in full. That might muddy the waters. So yeah, I do think it is a much murkier prospect where something is being carried out off-site rather than on-site.
Very good. Now, another one that has come out, it's more like two questions that are combined, and I'll try to summarize them. It's the issue of overseas transactions. So, in essence, the first question is asked whether prefabrication often is done overseas and whether the government can regulate specifically imports products. And so that's one part of the question. But the other one is also what is the role of the relevant building surveyor in that context, and how can they inspect work that is fabricated overseas?
Yeah, look, I think it would be very difficult to use that kind of work unless there is some kind of certificate of compliance for it. So if you're talking about a smaller product, even if it comes from overseas, you can still get test reports, or you can get, the manufacturer might, or the importer might seek to get a code mark certificate or something like that, so that compliance can be verified in Australia. If you're talking about sort of a larger item, I think it gets very difficult if it's been constructed completely off-site and you can't inspect the constituent elements of it, then I don't think there's a way for an RBS to be satisfied that it's compliant.
Yeah. And lastly, again, I'll try with this question to cover a few issues here that have been raised also in others. You spoke about the provisions to have, well, there's mandatory inspections that are prescribed in the building regulations, but there's also an opportunity for the RBS to prescribe some additional inspections, which are still mandatory if prescribed, my understanding, right? But they're additional.
Yes,
So,
yes,
and to clarify that, so there's also that opportunity, first of all. But also here, there's a question that here indicates that there's also the need to ultimately inspect everything once installed on site, right? So
yes.
that is that correct?
Yes, yes. And look, there is always sort of the mandatory final inspection,
Yeah.
but I think an RBS doing their job properly would also need to consider, is there an additional inspection that might be needed prior to final that that I need to carry out or cause to be carried out, where I can confirm that the installation itself has been done in a compliant, proper way.
Yeah. So the additional inspection, of course, do not override the ones that are already existing, and the final one being the one that, of course, everything on site has to be
Yeah,
verified. And this goes back, as there was an interesting question at the beginning. There was some exchange where ultimately prefabrication, it's only as good as when it's installed on site, right? So there's connection
yes,
to services, there's
yes.
foundation works, etc., that have to be compliant and executed on site, and that's where part of the risk perhaps lies, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So a product could be, designed and manufactured perfectly off-site, but if it's not installed correctly or the preparatory work that's done on site is not done properly, then you'll still end up with a raft of non-compliances and defect issues.
Okay, I'll close it here. So thank you very much, friend. This is a comprehensive overview, but also, yeah, we've highlighted, I think, quite clearly how the regulatory environment is shifting. So we have to somehow catch up on these things, and I'm sure
Yes.
we'll have opportunity to do that again in the future. You pointed out the fact that is a consultation process likely to happen. The Department of Transport and Planning is working on reforms on this, so we obviously encourage all the architects to contribute to that process. And so I'll thank you with this again, friend. I hope to see you again in the future.
Thank
And I
you.
thank everybody who's attended today. Thank you very much and see you next time.
Thank you.